Thank you so much for this opportunity, and I'm so humbled and honored to share this time with freedom fighters and human rights defenders that also share their stories, and they resonate in an impressive similarity of what I have gone through in Nicaragua and what many other Nicaraguans have suffered through the Daniel Ortega dictatorship. For me, it's truly painful in a way, particularly to listen to the previous exposition, since Mr. Navalny Alexei was a close friend during a time as fellows at Yale University. And back in 2010, we used to speak about many of these issues, and this is so real. We share at times in panels, we shake hands, we exchange cards, and many of these freedom fighters actually go back to the grassroots and to the front lines of freedom. And I've seen this over and over for the last 20 years. Many of the people in which we share these opportunities actually are trying to make a better world. So I truly, truly appreciate the honor and the opportunity to share my story. So in the case of Nicaragua, how do I change the next one? Sorry about that. Oh, wonderful, thank you. So in the case of Nicaragua, it's not a unique situation. The latest Freedom House report on freedom shows that for 18 consecutive years, democracy has been the decline globally. I'm sure you've seen this picture over and over again. So 80% of the world, in terms of population, lives in either a autocracy or a partially free country. Only 1 out of 5 people in the world actually gets to enjoy a free and open society. And by enjoying a society, we don't only mean votes, we actually mean financial freedom, respect of your property. And this is truly painful for many people like myself. Briefly, I don't want to go into personal details too much, but I think it's very important to know where do we come from at an intimate, individual level. Just as my wife, Berta, who is with me today, we were part of the wave of refugees in the 1980s. Berta came here when she was just a baby to the United States. I came as the first wave of unaccompanied minors to the United States, lived with foster parents, got to learn about this amazing country in many, many ways. And even though I was not with my parents, I was able to learn English, go to school here. But 2 years after that, I went back to Nicaragua when the Civil War was over. And what I found in Nicaragua was 16 years of not full democratic transition, but the evolution of a new type of dictatorship, something that I will label, I'm sure this has been used before, the dictatorship 2.0. So the classical idea of dictatorships, military juntas, military tanks in countries, or guys with military fatigues running countries, are not necessarily the case. Like most current autocracies are actually the case of illiberal regimes that have learned how to use the language of institutions, of democratic institutions, to create a facade of limited democracy, and that was the case of Nicaragua. So in my country, and I'm sure this applies to many of the other countries, what we see with these evolved and highly sophisticated authoritarian regimes is that they're even applauded by international institutions. So for example, Ortega was able to bring down in his second term, when he was back into government in 2007, the numbers of homicides to the lowest levels in Central America. And he was applauded by the United States Southern Command, by the United Nations, despite the fact that he was committed severe violations of privacy. He was basically copying Putin's book. So these type of evolved autocracies have certain characteristics, and this applies to many other countries. You can put other cases as well. Privacy violations, surveillance systems, social media monitoring, access to your bank accounts. So what we did in Nicaragua, in my case as part of an academic and activist movement, was try to develop social innovation into the human rights and advocacy world. One of the organizations we built was Nicaragua 2.0, which was the first grassroots movement. We were invited to speak, for example, at Facebook and Twitter back in 2009 to show what we were doing. We were using Twitter as a tool to communication and to organize. We developed one of the first apps in Latin America, sort of a Tinder for donors, in order to match human rights activists and potential donors. Well, guess what? Eventually, they cracked our systems, and they were able to hack into any single financial transactions from organizations such as Open Society, National Endowment for Democracy, USAID, European Union. But despite all that, the work of many, many organizations allowed that finally in 2018, hundreds of thousands of Nicaraguans went out to the streets. The regime, not being able to stop this massive protest, applied a policy that has been labeled by many international human rights organizations as the shoot-to-kill policy. Basically, they placed snipers in strategic places of the city of Managua and many other cities across Nicaragua, and they shoot against the civilian population, killing 325 people just in the first four months of the protest. Now, the UN report released in March clearly labels the Ortega regimes as criminals against humanity. The Ortega sanctions through the Magnitsky sanctions in the United States. But what was the response? Even after those massive protests, the response was to do massive incarceration. So between 2,000 and 2,200 people went through prisons in extreme, inhumane conditions. For example, not being able to have access to any lawyer. The lawyer that tried to defend me spent almost 2 years in prison. The other 3 lawyers are currently in exile. Their assets have been expropriated. My family was forced into exile. I was placed in house arrest for many months and later into extreme isolation at a maximum security prison. And this is the current situation of 130 people in Nicaragua. We are talking former presidential candidates, higher rank leaders of the Catholic and Protestant church in my country, journalists. So imagine a country when you can go to prison for raising the flag over your own country. I cannot think of any other country in the world in which it's illegal to raise the flag of your own country because it became the symbol of non-violent resistance. Imagine a country where the regime, the government, can transfer your assets and your property without any trial, without not even the facade of a system. They changed the registry of private property in order to make any property completely under the control of the regime. Also, we saw the shutdown of many organizations. I'll speak a little bit about that. And also, close to 15% of the population is currently forced into exile. Just in Costa Rica, as of last month, 240,000 Nicaraguans filed for requests of political asylum and refugee just in the neighboring Costa Rica. In the United States, about 400,000, 80,000 in Spain. So now we are getting close to 1 out of every 5 Nicaraguans fleeing the country after we couldn't, change the regime. Once again, based on the Freedom House report, Nicaragua ranks top #1 in the world based on an aggregate data of the last 10 years as the country that has advanced the most in limiting freedoms. But the part that for me is outrageous is the fact that just a few years ago, even my dear colleagues, I must confess, I define myself as a classical liberal, even my dear friends from classical liberalism as the Fraser Institute placed Ortega as one of the top in the world in financial freedom. And the question is why? Well, we try to play by the rules. Human rights organizations, we play by the rules. We presented our books. We open and disclose our donors. We came to the UN in a number of occasions. That's not an endorsement in any way, by the way, to speak to the then wonderful UN ambassador at the UN. And this was the response of the regime. The response of the regime was accuse me, in my particular case, of treason for coming to the US and speaking at the IMF, the World Bank, the UN, for presenting a report in front of the UN Human Rights Council in Geneva, for presenting a report at the Organization of American States. Thanks to the relentless work of my wife, I was able to hug my daughter Alejandra. You can imagine, for those of you who are parents, last time I saw my daughter before being blocked from from traveling abroad, she was 5, and I saw her again when she was 9. And it's almost like meeting a new person. And I experienced things in prison that I'm not yet to speak in public. But the very painful part is that we were able to advance in a number of areas. We were able to explain the electoral frauds, actually using highly sophisticated mathematical formulas to explain that there was no way that Ortega was winning elections. We were able to actually document extrajudicial killings. We were able to show how Ortega was actually using funds to pay criminal organizations to commit assassinations. But in one area we could not succeed, in particular area, and that is particularly financial systems and anti-money laundering laws that continue to be used against us. So for example, once I returned from my meeting at the UN, immediately 3 or 4 days later, all my bank accounts and personal accounts were frozen, our assets were frozen. 20 years of work, my previous life, many, many years ago, was part of the private equity world, were lost. Savings were actually lost. But that's not only the outrageous part. And let me show you this piece, with all due respect, if we have fellows from the IMF. This is a literal report from the IMF from last year, and I have to read this. It says, Nicaragua has enacted extensive legal reforms aimed to improve the anti-money laundering CFT framework, but further efforts are needed to strengthen effective implementation. In recent years, the authorities have adopted a comprehensive set of reforms to bring the legal framework in with international standards, understanding risk, enhancing international cooperation, improving the supervision of reporting entities, and implementing appropriate measures to prevent legal entities, NGOs, foundations, right, from being misused for criminal purposes. Okay, so which were some of those organizations? I'll tell you in a minute. But check this. We welcome Nicaragua's progress and remove it from the list of jurisdictions subject to increased monitoring. So Ortega, by shutting down these organizations, the Missionaries of Charity, by shutting down Operation Smile, by shutting down and expropriated the assets of the OAS, of the Boy Scouts Association, by expropriating the assets of the Jesuit community, by shutting down 26 universities and closing their bank accounts and their assets, by shutting down 11 religious organizations, by expropriating and confiscating the assets of the Red Cross, of the Federation of NGOs for Children, of my own foundation, and 3,400 most, gets praised by the IMF for applicating international, because they look at the numbers. Of course, Ortega broke the world record in shutting down bank accounts. So clearly the system is completely failed. And in the case of Bitcoin, I'll end up by saying something. I'm completely agnostic to Bitcoin in the sense that I've been working for years in finding technology. I've been working as a strategist with around 40 groups of equal number of countries around the world to find technologies that work, to bring human dignity to people, to find technology that can empower grassroots activists, to find technologies that can actually educate women in countries in which their rights are completely violated. So, but we could not find any other technology that is so effective as Bitcoin. I want to publicly thank my wife that led us to Alex Gladstein a few years ago and has helped us to build this very powerful network. So when it comes to Bitcoin, I end up by saying a couple of things. First of all, it's completely understandable that when something is not fully understood, there is fear. And I think that has happened with any technology. When cell phones came around, when internet came around, people got scared. And that's what's happened particularly with Bitcoin. But Bitcoin is a technology that works for human rights defenders. It's a technology that works to protect the privacy of people. As of today, there are people in prison in Nicaragua for doing the catering of a event of a human rights organization. There are people in prison for being hired to take pictures. Victor Tikai, a journalist, sentenced to 8 years in prison for taking pictures at a religious event. And all this was accessed by looking at the financial transactions provided by banks. Up until today, I cannot hold a bank account in the United States, for example, because of Ortega's putting me in the blacklist, while the IMF is praising Mr. Ortega for his amazing use of anti-money laundering laws. So Bitcoin works. We need to understand this technology. I'm not here to do any advocacy or activism in the for-profit or financial dimension of Bitcoin. It is truly a tool for freedom. Thank you.